the problem is that resistance has developed, right? And if we measure that here in the state of Georgia, in cow-calf farms, and 100% of the farms had resistance to ivermectin drug class. So this is a big issue, and none of the producers were aware of it. They were aware that worms are a problem. That's why they deworm on a schedule, but they didn't recognize that they had a problem with drug resistance. So you are treating, but you're not seeing the effects of the drug.
Welcome to the Beef Podcast, brought to you by Wisenetics. I'm your host, Brandy Buzzard, and it's my pleasure to bring you the latest trends and issues from the best and brightest minds in the beef industry. Today, we are joined by Dr. Leonor Gianechini, Assistant Professor in the Department of Infectious Diseases at the University of Georgia. Dr. Gianechini earned her PhD and completed postdoctoral research at the University of Georgia, and also earned her DVM from the University of the Republic in Uruguay. Her work focuses on sustainable parasite control and anthelmintic resistance in livestock, and she's focused on improving how we diagnose, monitor, and understand resistance in cattle and small ruminants, and in developing approaches that can be applied in real-world production settings. Parasites are on the agenda for today's episode, which is sponsored by Boehringer Ingelheim. So with that, let's dive right in. Welcome to the podcast today, Dr. Gianechini. How are you?
Hey, thank you. Thanks for that introduction. I'm doing well.
We're excited to have you here to talk about some very important topics. But to start off with, for those who may not be very familiar with you or your work, if you could just bring us up to speed on your background, how you got started in the beef and cattle industry, and kind of your career thus far, that would be great.
I have to say that I got into this probably by force, because I'm a farmer's daughter. So I did not choose it. But I have to say that, when you grow up on a farm, it's just different, right? Like, you get to appreciate nature and natural processes in a different way. And so you become curious about, I would say, everything. And hard work is just like normal to you, right? Like, you don't know anything else. And so I knew at a very young age that I wanted to take care of animals, and then I wanted to become a veterinarian. And so I got into veterinary school in Uruguay. But when I was getting towards the end of my career, I did an internship in Argentina, in the north of Argentina. And I heard that they had this kind of like, Dr. House residency program that we would go to farms and figure out, what was going on with diseases. And that's where I did my residency in animal health. So right after vet school, I got into a residency diagnosing, outbreaks. We would go to the farm, do necropsies or collect samples, and then go back to the labs and figure out what was going on. So that's how I got into this disease. And parasites were a big part of that. So that's how I got into parasites. But then working with the folks there, in the National Institute of Agriculture Technology in Buenos Aires, I heard of, that the referent in the world of, drug resistance, Dr. Ray Kaplan, he was looking for a PhD student and someone with clinical background. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to give it a try, right? Like, why not? Send my CV, and a few months go by and I just hear from him. I get interviewed, and then I just, got accepted into the program here at UGA. Did my PhD with him, my postdoc with him, and here I am as an assistant professor.
Boehringer Ingelheim puts cattle first. They deliver cutting-edge vaccines, parasiticides, and supplements to help keep cattle healthy and productive. From supporting fresh cows with Bovical calcium boluses to protecting your herd with pyramid vaccines, Boehringer stands with veterinarians and producers every step of the way. Put cattle first on your operation. Learn more at bianimalhealth.com/cattle.
You have certainly been all over. Like, you have had a lot of stops along the way. But one thing as I was listening to you describe your your background and your work and such like that, is that you've studied resistance at a very deep level. Like you've devoted your educational career to that, using genetic and laboratory tools that a lot of farms may not have access to. So I just said, let's just talk a little bit about like, how does that kind of research that you've been doing translate into something that's useful for a producer or a veterinarian?
That's a great question. And sometimes it's not very straightforward, right? Because when we're investigating this type of, like deep level things in our lab, it requires many years of just like studying the same worms and looking at them in the microscope, and then like running tests on them, and they just sort of become your family, right? And then we try to figure out like, okay, they behave this way, what's in their DNA that makes them behave this way, right? Like, for example, survive to a drug treatment. And that answer is not very straightforward because they are so diverse that when we take a look at them, it's like every worm is like like it would be a different human being. So we try to get to the gene that drives resistance. And then if we find it, then we need to translate that into forms. And so then it begins a second step that it would be, okay, how does this translate in reality where I don't have all of the right, like background controlled, right? Like my environment control in the lab. Now, how do I check these things? And one of the problems I would believe is like, right, sequencing is getting cheaper for us and we can do it in research and get to, right? But then is it cheap enough so that we can get these to farmers right now? I don't think so, but I think we're making great progress. And at the end of the day, the goal will be to have all of those resistant markers and being able to just grab a sample from the farm, send it to my lab or any other diagnostic lab, and me being able to tell you, hey, you have, resistance to these different dewormers and in these different parasites. So you should, for your next treatment, be using X, Y, and Z. So that's kind of like our goal, but sometimes that takes 5, 10 years, 15. There's people that have dedicated their lives to understand worms. And so it may take a while, but we'll get there.
Yeah, well, I hope you do. I mean, that's important to manage and control these parasites. Why, and maybe I should have asked this first, but why should producers and veterinarians, why should they care about gastrointestinal parasites? Why should they care about the research you're doing? Like, what kind of impact can these parasites have on animal health and farm productivity?
Well, I will say that the problem with, internal worms, so stomach and intestinal worms, is that a lot of their impact is kind of like under the surface, right? And what I mean by that is that unless we're like checking, right, all of the losses are going to be mainly subclinical. So, for example, reduced weight gain, lower milk production in the dams, and so less food available to those calves. So you will end up with a lighter calf. Poor reproductive performance. It may take you longer to actually reach, breeding weights in your heifers, or, it may take another cycle for your cows to actually get pregnant, or weaker immunity, because this is another thing that parasites affect. They actually modulate the immune system of the animals, and so they may not be responding optimally to vaccinations for other pathogens. And it may get to the point that this is clinical and you will see diarrhea and you will see bottle jaw and all of these things and even death. But that's, the extreme. Normally, everything is subclinical.
Right. Subclinical. You can't see it immediately. It's not, below the surface. And things that are below the surface are hard to see when you're just out every day trying to get the cows fed and to do other things like that. A lot of producers have been deworming their cattle, the same way for a long time. This is what they've used for a long time. They're going to keep using it. What are some, is that a mistake? What are some of the most common mistakes that you're going to see in a parasite control program?
Well, I think the problem is to, still be using the recommendations that we have from like 20 years ago. So unfortunately, the drugs that we have today in the market are the same ones, like the same drug classes that we had 40 years ago, 60 years ago. So we had the introduction of the white wormers in the 60s, and then we had the introduction of the ivermectins, like drug class in the 80s, and we have been using those two drug classes mainly for all of this time.
Mm-hmm.
And so the problem is that resistance has developed, right? And if we measure that here in the state of Georgia, in cow-calf farms, and 100% of the farms had resistance to ivermectin drug class. So this is a big issue, and none of the producers were aware of it. They were aware that worms are a problem. That's why they deworm on a schedule, but they didn't recognize that they had a problem with drug resistance. So you are treating, but you're not seeing the effects of the drug, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so a big issue with that is that we deworm our animals on a whole herd calendar. So let's say I will do it at the beginning of the spring, every year. And the thing is that these worms are very dynamic, right, in the pasture, in how they infect our animals. And so to give you an example, right now we're having a severe drought, right? Everything is dry out there here in the state of Georgia. And if you just think about all the biological processes of these worms, a lot of their population is going to be out in the pasture.
Yeah.
So we're going to treat, right, when you give a dewormer, you're just treating what's inside. Mm-hmm. But what survives is going to be laid out in the pasture.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. But when, the weather conditions are very dry, these worms don't, survive very well in the pasture. And so what happens is that they will die. You don't have what we call refugia, that are worms that, are not selected by the drug, that actually dilute all of those resistant worms. And so if you treat right now, like you normally would do in every year, then the problem becomes that everything that survives that treatment goes into the pasture, and it's going to become seeded with resistant worms. And so what I mean by that is we have to be intentional about when we treat and how we treat, not just on a schedule, right?
Right, yeah.
The other thing, point number 2, underdosing. So to me, this is a very big issue that we have. And I know this is not easy, right? Because who weighs all of their animals before treating? It adds a lot of work.
Time, and a lot of time.
If there's one thing that farmers are, is like overwork. So I understand that. But I would say, if you don't, weigh your animals and you are underdosing, so giving less, deworming that the animal actually needs, then sublethal concentrations of the drug are going to reach the worms. And that means that some of those worms are going to be able to survive that dose. And so what we start creating and compounding is, resistance in the population of worms. And so what you can do, because the ivermectin drug class and the white wormers, they are very safe. And so if you give a bit more to some animals, that's not a problem. The real problem becomes when you give a lot less. So if you can weigh at least your biggest animal, or a couple of your biggest animals, you can dose according to that weight.
Just dose at the largest animals. Gotcha.
Exactly. So that would be the second issue that I see, very commonly. We just eyeball the weights, and then, we give less dose than what the animals need. The third thing, and I think it's connected to what I was talking today, at the beginning with the whole herd calendar treatment, is the dose and move. One of the things that we were, recommended before, when we had very efficacious anthelmintics, that's not the case anymore because we have resistance, is that we dose the animals and then we move them to a clean pasture. right? Because there are not going to be a lot of worms in that pasture. Well, the problem with that is that each time that we do that, we are seeding our clean pasture with worms that survive the treatment. So everything that's going to go in there in that pasture is going to be resistant worms. So if we're treating, we have to be conscientious and intentional about where do they go next. And it would be better if they actually stay for a few days in a pasture that they had been using, or we know that there were animals in there and that it's contaminated. That would be optimal. And then the last one, underneath, I think, all of these, is that we do not test. We don't test for resistance. And, if you don't look for the problem, of course you're not going to find one. And this is the whole discussion that I have with my dad in cholesterol, right, and high blood pressure. He's not going to have high blood pressure or cholesterol if he does not do a lipid panel, right? And so this is the thing, the same thought is that you're not going to have resistant worms if you don't, test for them. So I think initially it would be nice if producers start at least, post-treatment, taking samples and being able to check, is there anything surviving here?
That was a wonderful analogy about cholesterol. So how can a producer actually tell if they have a resistance problem on their operation? What does that testing look like? And is it accessible to like the everyday producer or veterinarian?
What we have today, it's not optimal. It's more work than we want, but you don't need to do it every year. You could do it every, other year to test the efficacy of the dewormers in your farm. And the way you would do that is you choose, when you're going to deworm your calves, you're going to pick samples right prior to deworming them. Those samples, you're going to ship them to the lab, and then 14 days later, you should pick samples again from those same animals, right? After treatment. So before and post-treatment samples. And that way in the lab, we can take a look at the eggs and that reduction, right, in the number of eggs. And so there's different ways to do this. Like we now have new guidelines out there for veterinarians and for researchers. We have a protocol that's more stringent, that is for research, and then another one that is for, clinical, really. So the other caveat to this is that we can also pool samples, and that becomes cheaper. So because if not, you would have to do, right, around 15, I would say, fecal accounts pre and around 15 post to test for one drug class. But we can reduce that number to around 3 fecal accounts pre and post if we pool the samples. It's not going to be, it's not going to have the resolution of doing the whole test that way, but it's going to give, at least it's going to give you a number. Your, dewormer is working on the 85% or the 90 or, not at all. And the thing with that is, I will say, please do not pool the samples yourself in the farm. We need to get the samples individually. And then we can grab exact, same quantity from each of those individuals and then pool them. I don't want to receive a sleeve. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, so that would be the only caveat. But, I think that would be a great, so you will get great information from a reduced number of fecals, and that it's not going to be very expensive. And so it's like that to me, I will compromise that accuracy of doing, right, 20 samples pre and 20 samples post for at least having a number every year, right?
I'm the visual. Has someone done that? Just brought the sleeve in?
Oh, yeah. We receive all kinds of things. And so it's we just, Yeah. So the sleeve happens, and it happens a lot, and then you're like, pressing the fingers in the sleeve to try to get your sample from. But anyways.
Well, that is a nice visual for sure.
Yeah.
So looking ahead into the future, what does a sustainable parasite control strategy look like for a cattle operation? And how can we stay ahead as an industry, but as individual producers, how can we stay ahead of these resistance challenges?
I think it's a bit counterintuitive from what we used to, recommend, right? We know that worms cause all of these issues in an operation, right? And so our thought would be, okay, we need to get rid of all of the worms. The problem is that since these worms have a big population in the environment, we're never going to get rid of them. And so we have to compromise on that. We cannot eradicate them. That's not our strategy. What we need to do is to control them. And the way to control them is with what we call refugia-based strategies. So before we were recommending, we need to break the cycle of the parasite, right? Like we need to treat everything strategically and, frequently. And now we're saying, no, we need to leave worms that escape drug selection so that we can maintain a susceptible, pool of genes out there so that our dewormers can, work long time.
Mm-hmm.
The issue here is that we don't know when we're going to get another class of anthelmintics, of dewormers, right, coming into our market.
Right, yeah.
There's a couple of them that have been, in the market elsewhere, like Europe, Australia, South America, Monepantal and Derquantal, so 2 different drug classes. They haven't entered the market here. We don't know if they will. So we have to work with the 2-3 drug classes, right? Like levamisole, and then we have macrocyclic lactones, that ivermectin and benzimidazoles for a long time. We have to think this is our toolkit to manage. Mm-hmm. So with that, it will become, okay, we will treat our animals, but we will not treat everybody. We will leave some animals untreated. So the worms, there are going to be worms in there that are going to be susceptible, right? Then the other thing is we need to start using drugs in combination before we have more drug failure. And what that means is giving 2 or 3 dewormers from different drug classes concurrently, or using one that it's already in combination, like there's a new product out in the market. Why? Because we know the math is dramatic. If we give, 2 drugs that have 90% efficacy each, and we give them in rotation, we give one and then we give the other. Each time that we give one of those, we're going to have 10% of the worms surviving each treatment.
Right, yeah.
But if we combine them, then we're going to be killing, most of our worms, like 99% of them.
Yeah.
And so that 1% will be diluted with, the animals that we left untreated. Yeah. And so it's very important that we use highly efficacious treatments along with refugia, which is like leaving some animals untreated. And then something I want to clarify here as well is that resistance can develop in our farm, right? But we can also buy it.
Oh.
So what that means is that when we introduce animals into our pastures, we need to think that that animal did not leave the worms right in the door and then came in. No, it brought everything with it. And so we will need to quarantine those animals, give them a good treatment, and check that they don't have anything before putting them to the pasture. Otherwise, you could just end up, with anthelmintic resistance because you brought it from another place.
Yeah.
And then I would say the last thing, right, like of a sustainable parasite control is thinking about parasite control intentionally, because this is dynamic, right? You have worms that have a, part of their life cycle outside, part of their life cycle inside the animals. And so that part of the life cycle outside the animal is dependent on the environment and the climatic conditions. And it's not going to be the same from year to year. So we need to think, okay, maybe this year I will delay my treatment because, everything is dry out there. I don't have many worms in my pasture. If I treat right now, I'm just going to be selecting for resistance like very hard. And so, it's thinking about my deworming, treatments with more intention. So I think that's kind of like what we should be doing as sustainable parasite control.
You were talking about how like it doesn't, I thought about this while you said it, but like when you deworm animals, like it doesn't get rid of all of them, right? You said it like leaves 10%. We never fully have them eradicated. And it just reminded me of like, from a pasture management standpoint, that's what we deal with in with weeds, right? Like you're never fully get rid of the weeds. Like you always are going to have them around. So I just thought of that while you were talking. But you answered the other question. We got that you were talking about like a sustainable parasite control strategy and how we stay ahead of the resistance challenge. And you covered that with like talking about quarantining animals once they get to your farm or ranch. Like I had never thought about that you buy resistance. I mean, we quarantine animals when they come to our ranch because they might, like if they have some respiratory thing, right? Like we don't, but I've never thought about it from a parasite standpoint. So I think that you've really outlined that quite well on some different strategies that we can use to, to stay ahead of that resistance challenge.
And I mean, fortunately, in the future, right, like I'm working towards like improving diagnostic tests so that it could become easier, right? Like instead of like having to treat the animals and doing pre and post treatment sampling, the end goal of my program is to have, tests that by sending a pool of feces to me, I could tell you, this is the profile of resistance in your farm, and these are the worms that you need to take care of. And so I think the future is bright, but, it will take us a little bit to get there. And while we wait for, new drug classes or new diagnostic tests, we just need to grab whatever we have right now and use it. Because if we don't do that, we're going to end up in a very serious, situation. When we did that study here in Georgia, we had Ostertagia, which is the brown worm, surviving ivermectin treatment. Mm-hmm. And that's very concerning because Ostertagia, right, will get into the abomasum and will destroy the glands. And then those glands that are the ones that produce acid are not, functional anymore. And so the animal will not be able to digest protein. And with that comes diarrhea, bacterial overgrowth, right? And just like a weaker immune system. And then the animal can get other stuff, as you were mentioning, respiratory syndrome, right? And so if we, keep selecting for drug resistance in some of those worms, it's going to be very problematic. So let's act now with what we have. Let's, start checking our animals, do fecals here and there, post-treatment at least, what's, surviving, and start tailoring a control program for our farms.
It's time for our famous 3.
Tired of the 21-day shot show? Stop hitting the cortisol hornet's nest with a wiffle ball bat every time you wean, transport, commingle, do shoot work, or experience Mother Nature's mood swings with weather. The cortisol surge can't be stopped, but it can be proactively controlled. QFA 2000 is a proactive approach to reducing the risk of BRD in calves. QFA 2000 reduces the use of antimicrobials, improves innate immune function, and allows the calf to do what it's meant to do, efficiently gain weight. For less than half the cost of antimicrobials, you can take a proactive, hands-off approach with your calves. Control the 21-day cortisol surge and control your drug costs with QFA 2000. For more information, contact us at applied-biotechnologies.com.
Just a reminder to our audience that if you're enjoying this episode of the Beef Podcast presented by Wisenetics and sponsored by Boehringer Ingelheim, please remember to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. We've reached the episode, or the part of our episode where we kind of rotate to what I call our human interest questions. And so I gave you some heads up on these so you wouldn't be just like caught completely off guard. So same questions of all of our guests. And so the first one is, what is your favorite beef or cattle related resource? It could be a book or a website or a person or a TV show, right? So it could be any beef or cattle related resource.
I think I have a few of them that I like and enjoy, but I will say, if I think about like drug resistance and right, like in sustainable parasite control and all of these things that I'm interested, there's a lot of resources from Europe. We're trying to create our own here in the state. It's just a heads up. We're coming up with what will be called the cattle consortium for parasite control. So we're working on that. But there's a few of them in Europe, like cows. One of them is cows. The other one is called Spark. And then you have many of these that are websites that will put a lot of resources out there for, dealing and managing parasite control. So I think that is a really good asset and place to check, for updated information.
Okay, wonderful. I have not had that answer before, so that's great. The next question is, what is your favorite non-beef or cattle-related book, or one that you are currently reading?
Okay. Yeah, I think I have to, think a bit about that, because I once gave a talk that the name of the talk was, is it all about cows? Right? Because like in my life, I think everything is about cows, and every, downstream action just comes from a cow related one. But like, a book that I have been reading lately. Well, I think that I always go back to, like, I'm a romantic in my soul. I always go back to read when I have time, like Sense and Sensibility. And I did watch the movies, and yeah, like I really like it. And when you're learning English in my country, that's one of the books that they make you read. And so, yeah, so that one I think is probably one of my top ones. Yeah.
Okay, I have not had that answer either, but it's a classic. That's great. I love these questions. I learned so much about people. I love this. And then the last one of these human interest questions is, when you think of someone you admire or look up to, what is a characteristic they have possessed that has led them to be successful? It doesn't have to be, you don't have to name the person if you don't want to, but just generally, like, what is a characteristic they have? If you want to name the person, you can, but you don't have to.
Yeah, I think resilience, right? I think that capacity to overcome, right, like tough times and just to keep going when you don't know if, at the end of the day, it's going to be worth it. I think that's the main characteristic that I look, on people that I admire. And that's because, right, like a lot of things in life are like that. It's like that delayed gratification, right? Like you go through grade school, you're scratching your brains with anatomy and right, like physiology and all of these things, but at the end of the the career, you're like grateful you did all of that. The same with a PhD. There were points that I was like, I'm not gonna finish this. I don't know why did I get into this. Yes, and so resilience, right? Like resilience is what always like keeps you going. And for that, I have to say, I have to admire both of my parents for that. Farmers are very resilient. And right, like I believe that that's a main, quality that they have, and that, like keeps them going when things are not, as successful or like bright looking right now. They do it because it's their passion. And so, yeah.
Well, I totally agree. Resilience is a characteristic that most farmers and ranchers possess. And I think, it's going to help you, not you specifically, but it help people go further in life if they could be resilient. So, that is all the questions and time we have for today. I really enjoyed talking to you about cattle worms. And but thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Leonor Gianechini. If listeners have questions for you or want to learn more about our discussion today, where can they do that?
Well, I'm in the process of getting my webpage for the lab started, but you can search at UGA, our official, university website. There you will have my information and my contact if you want to reach out to our lab. So University of Georgia official website would be the place to search my profile.
Okay, well, wonderful. And then just thank you again, Dr. Leonor Gianechini, for being here. Thank you to Boehringer Ingelheim for sponsoring this episode. And thank you for our audience for tuning in. And we'll meet you back here next week on another episode of the Beef Podcast presented by Wisenetics.